Good morning and welcome to WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make New Haven tick. Well, here's a man who's helped make New Haven tick and a lot of people far and wide tick for decades now. Doug Ray, he's a professor emeritus at Yale School of Management and Political Science at Yale. And I would argue New Haven and maybe America's greatest authority on cities. Why do cities even exist? What do they do? What they can be like? And the reason I've asked Doug, my good friend, to come on the show today is because during the COVID-19 pandemic, people have been thinking about this question. What's happening to cities now, the worst pandemic in a century, and what's going to happen next? Doug Ray, welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM.
Great to see you, Paul.
Same here. And before we went on the air, we said that you are sheltered at home and you're feeling safe and well. We don't have to worry about you. You're plugging away in a book I've been waiting to read for, I think, 10 years now, about 2 Cheers for Capitalism.
Yeah, don't remind me.
That's a problem with people who really think about stuff. You can't just write it out and spit it out and throw it out to the world. But one of the I would argue most influential book was City, Urbanism and Its End, which used New Haven as a case study about the way cities evolved over the last couple of centuries and where they're headed next. So I guess the first question I ask you, Doug, is during COVID-19, has your thinking about cities been affected? Are you thinking about cities in relation to this pandemic?
Sure. And I mean, the whole world is thinking about New York. Which is the COVID-19 capital of the planet. And New Haven is, with respect to this epidemic and a lot of other things, New Haven is a neighborhood of Greater New York. And one thing that has caught a lot of people's attention is a reversal of the tendency in the last 20 years to learn to like cities over again. And one effect may be that, the simplest thing would be for everybody to move into suburbs or exurbs and isolate themselves from the density that makes the epidemic burn so hot in most parts of New York City itself and its immediate environs. The 3 Connecticut counties that are pretty hot with COVID-19 are
with density.
Yeah, they're dense and they're connected by rail and highway to the city through, I'm thinking of Fairfield, New Haven, and to a slightly lesser degree, Hartford County.
Well, Doug, you used the word, let's get this word right on the table, dense. I don't want to be dense about it. I want to let people know what we're talking about. Tell me if this is the right way to put it. Cities are known for the density. That's their strength when things are going well and their weakness when it's not. That means stuff squished together. People, stuff to do. Per square foot, there are more people, there are more stores, there are more nightclubs, there are more offices. And then you talked about the last 20 years when people, especially without young kids, but even some of them, have learned to love cities again. New Havens thrive, New York's thrive, because they love the mixing of different people, the ideas that are generated together, as well as the environmental benefits. So is density, and you've always had such an impact on my thinking over the years, and you had me thinking, as a lot of now are thinking, that New Haven should pursue density extremely, which was only a new idea in New Haven. That was since the early 90s. Is that going to be, because short term or long term, are they the same factors? Because I remember after 9/11, people were saying we're going to leave New York now, but they didn't. New York got more populous once we got used to it. People are now saying we're going to leave New York, go live someplace less dense. But is that also just going to be a blip?
I think, the Yogi Berra line about it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Uh, the um, I think it's quite possible that second or third tier cities that are um, a lot smaller than New York, um, will benefit from um, outmigration from the real metropolis of New York or Chicago or LA. Um, and New Haven, um, New Haven has some real attractions for people who like cities but um, don't want to pay the rents or take the risks involved in a real metropolis. Um,
Now, I
the
think, is it fair to say that this is a trend that's been happening? This one analysis of COVID-19's effect on society is that it's going to accelerate trends that were already well in motion: working from home, distance learning, communication, where we're less human beings face to face and more Zoom to Zoom like this. The trend, tell me if this is the way you see it. New Haven already was benefiting from that. You can work more remotely, or you have two people, one person works at Yale, one works at New York. You had the transit. People liked New Haven. Our population grew. We got more jobs because it had enough density that you could find other interesting people. You could have variety of people, variety of ideas. You could find an interesting job. You could go out at night. We were having nights with, four really good concerts on a weeknight within 4 blocks of each other, of State Street, College Street, and Chapel. Maybe you don't need to have 40. Four is enough at a night if you're going to live at those new apartments. So that's why we've had $250 million from one developer alone invested in building new market rate apartments. Are you optimistic, Doug? Do you think that once this shakes out, we learn how to permanently live with an era of pandemics, that New Haven will continue that growth because of the reason you just identified, or will anything step in the way?
um, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, there is a little bit of resemblance um, between New Haven now and New Haven in 1985, 80, 86, 87, when there was a building boom and then a building glut.
Mhm.
Um, and people in the real estate business have bravely soldiered on, but it sure is a lot of housing. And
Well, that's a different question. That's the cycles of building, right? Where the
right,
way modern capitalism works, where there are short-term games often because you resell your debt, that you're waiting to be, you don't want to be the last person to hot potato. So when stuff gets built in New Haven, it gets sold pretty quickly after being built. Randy Salvador built a novella at Chaplain House. I'm talking about the phenomenon you just described. He puts it up, then he sells it to someone. We all know that there are cycles. So in Winchester Avenue in Science Park, there are $3,000 a month one-room apartments built by the same developer who built the Nets Stadium in Barclays in New York. We know that those rents are going to come down. And I always bring up that period. You bring up our earlier building boom. Is it fair to say that there's such a dramatic difference in scale with this boom, that at the end of the 80s, when we had that boom and then we hit a recession, and we're going to hit a recession again, which is another reason I really like your analogy, everything seems smaller compared to now. We built a lot of condos in Fairhaven. We built some stuff downtown, but not tons. We still had to offer pretty good sizable tax breaks for downtown development. We still didn't get the arena block built at Grove Street and Audubon. This time around, as I said, there's one developer alone from Fairfield County put $250 million into 4 projects, and there are many others. We didn't have to give a single tax break unless there was an affordable housing component. So much more is being built. And this recession appears like it might be much worse than the recession that shut it all down last time. The question is, who are these human beings going to live in these apartments? This time we actually had a population growth, which we didn't have last time. And we had new jobs created in the tech sector, and Yale continued to grow. But to your point, Yale might shrink a little now, right?
um, There's actually no reason for um, Yale to diminish itself, or even to diminish the rate at which it builds new stuff. Yale is in a wonderful position if the question is attracting students.
Mhm.
The question of the health of the city, health literally in the health of all of us who live here, but health also in the future of smaller businesses, which are really important to the way the city looks and feels and acts. If the closing and not reopening rate among, say, restaurants is 20%, 25%, the city is going to be injured pretty seriously in the course of the recession that you referred to, and that is, I think, a lead pipe cinch to happen. I
Yeah.
think there's
So for us here
no doubt
locally,
about.
no one doubts it's going to be the recession. I would argue, tell me if you agree with this, the downturn we had in the late 80s devastated us because we were still in the process of losing our old economy. Macy's was closing, the last manufacturers were closing or turning into robots on Long Wharf. I think we might have done better than some other places in the 2006 to 2010 downturn because we'd become a nonprofit economy with healthcare and Yale, as your book was the first to point out to all of us. The top two employers now for a couple of decades in New Haven, Yale and Yale New Haven, have more jobs than the next 8 employers combined. That was not the case before. And then that might have helped us weather the storm. And what I'm wondering whether I'm hearing from you this time is this a short-term impact and a long-term impact? Long-term, our fundamental economy might be pretty strong because Yale's market position doesn't drop. People are still going to pay a lot to go to that school. Yale New Haven's not going to drop. People are still going to get sick. But that short term, the small business economy that hires so many people and depends on that sector might be harmed a lot, especially if Yale doesn't reopen. Is that the big question, whether Yale reopens in the fall?
I think it is a question. I think Yale will. I think there will be a school year at Yale. Whether it will begin in late August, as it has in recent years, or a month or two later, I think is open to some question.
So you don't believe that it could be at its peak at the worst around November, December, rather than August, September? It's hard to model, isn't it? Too many factors.
It's all about predicting the future. What you would have to have is a method of testing people, students, faculty, staff, which was cheap and gave you results quickly. And you would also have to have some slack in dorm space, which might be achieved by leasing hotel space or something.
That's interesting.
You would have to be able to isolate people if they tested positive, and have them do distance learning, even if they're in regular courses that are meeting with people in the room during their isolation period. And I'm not involved in any of the strategic planning at the university. And I listened to Peter Salovey and Scott Strobel in their town hall broadcast last week. And I was impressed. I was very impressed with Strobel. Seems to be all over the operational details that are going to be such a challenge.
Did you read yesterday, former Yale president Rick Levin and Vice President Linda Lomer put out a report for the state about schools reopening? I found that a very interesting report. I read it last night. It wasn't saying there's one plan for all size fits all, but there are some pretty general principles, which is that gradually reopen, beginning with office functions and labs. Go to the classes as long as you have enough testing kits in place, as long as the numbers have continued to decline, and as long as you have an ability to quickly isolate. So they seem to think like you that it could happen, that we could see the human beings back in New Haven and buying stuff. I don't know.
Well, I certainly hope we have students back on campus. New Haven is a different place with no students, and and not as interesting a place, and not as vibrant commercially.
Of course. And we're peering into the future with Professor Doug Ray, an author, our foremost expert on cities. And we're peering in the future of urban America from New Haven and elsewhere here on Dateline New Haven, WNHH FM 103.5, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Harry Joes, do we have any questions from listeners?
We have one from Bob. He says, no more Coliseum, no more mall. Why does New Haven rely on Yale so much?
Great question, Bob. Thanks.
It's a very good question. Well, I mean, the 100-year story is that this was a vibrant industrial city with dozens of big organizations making good money and paying good wages. And New Haven was one among many. And most of the rest has melted away. And New Haven is very Yale-centered now. There's very little doubt about that.
Well, our engine now is a nonprofit economy, eds and meds, education, healthcare. And I would argue, I think you've argued, that made it stronger for working class people, especially since there's unionization at Yale, but even at Yale New Haven, where there's not unionization, they get paid well and have good benefits. That actually might, you headed a poverty commission in New Haven. I might argue that the biggest factor that's addressed poverty is the growth in decent wage and decent benefit jobs at those two employers at a time when other cities have been devastated by the similar loss of a factory base.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of truth in that, and the arrival of new immigrant population in the city has been, for the most part, a really good phenomenon.
You and I both lived in Fairhaven before the wave of immigration. The place was beat, and now it's thriving. A lot more people are working, a lot more stores are open until the pandemic. The pandemic's going to have an impact on that.
Well, and the impact of the pandemic on all those businesses along Grand Avenue in Fairhaven that I'm a little fearful about if we don't get the economy up and going sometime by late summer, say, that an awful lot of those businesses will just perish.
That's right. And Doug Ray, I'd like to go back to what I'm wondering if I correctly got the gist of what you said earlier and apply it to this question. I think what I was hearing you from earlier was that you are cautiously optimistic that the trends that have helped New Haven succeed in the last 2 decades, a rebirth of smaller cities, being a smaller New York where it's still urban and interesting, but not as overwhelmingly dense, will continue once we get past the short-term problems of this pandemic. But that short-term, you're very concerned about the impact on small business without Yale students here, and that separately, you're worried about the immigrant economy that's helped the city so much, whether it's going to be weather and extended shutdown. Is that a fair way of saying it so far?
Yep, it is.
Long term, what about immigration? The Trump administration has, with Stephen Miller, use this as an opportunity, the way that everybody on all sides of the political spectrum are trying to use this as a political opportunity to push their plans. They're trying to stop immigration. They're trying to use this as the way to cut it off, and there really isn't much immigration happening now. Will that have a long-term impact in New Haven, or did we get enough of a boost of new energy, and will things eventually return to a state in which we can get that inflow of people who want to be here, who work hard, who don't take much from the government, and produce jobs and taxes?
Um, well, I hope that's right.
No, I mean, what do you think? What do you think's going to happen?
Well, I'm the next election is going to make a big difference. Um, the Trump Miller policy of Make America White Again is disastrous, and the beating an incumbent president, even a fairly unpopular and decidedly incompetent one, is not easy. And I'm not betting any money on the outcome of the election.
Well, you're a political scientist. You've studied elections and inequalities. I don't have the same expertise. I don't see a way that Trump doesn't win.
You see no way that he loses.
I don't see how he can lose, because I don't see the way political discourse occurs now, and the amount of extra money he has to frame the issue, and the way that Fox News and that network has convinced people not to think more than 30 seconds in the past and frames every failure as a success, and the way that people like to watch Donald Trump on TV. There's just people just like to see him on TV, which is really, I think, what elections are largely about. And Joe Biden, very nice man. Anytime this Trump election becomes about anything other than Donald Trump, I don't see how he motivates someone to vote for him. He did motivate black voters in the South in the primaries at that crucial moment, who liked the idea that he generally was able to be in a second position to an African-American president. I think that counted for a lot. And also I guess I'm a little pessimistic about the way that Republicans have succeeded with gerrymandering and with the rules of elections in places like Georgia and Wisconsin and Ohio. Thankfully, I don't have the expertise, because I don't see a path to victory for the Democrats. They don't have a candidate who would make someone want to vote for them, and they might not have the means to overcome the strong case against the incumbent.
Well, I think the path to victory for the Dems would include a sustained and very well designed assault on the performance of the Trump administration, beginning to end, and it's got to be designed to speak to people who were Trump voters the last time around. Not you only need to shave off 5% of 5%, or much less than 5%,
in just a few states, about a half dozen
in the
states,
right states. And seen from Michigan, the Trump administration is a horror show, and I think it's got to be gloves off, and you don't have to lie. You just have to pound on. Think about recommending that we inject Clorox or Lysol.
Right.
I mean, just all you got to do is let him be seen at it in his most inept moments and most unempathetic moments.
And Doug Ray, in your book Urbanism and Its End, you looked at the way that larger trends affected the development and the trajectory of cities like New Haven, when we went to different ways of moving goods and services, different ways of designing factories and where they'd be, different ways of paying workers and unions. What do you see the trends in the next post-pandemic period auguring for cities, big cities like New York, smaller ones like New York. I mean, I think the information economy, we all would agree, really benefited cities. People wanted to be close to each other to share those ideas. You didn't need to build factories that needed a lot of space spread out. These weren't unionized sectors. Those weren't issues. What's going to happen at the next stage with the way that intellectual goods and the economy operates? Will cities have that same advantage they've had for the last 20 years?
I think so. I mean, hospitals are not, by and large, going to the suburbs,
Mm.
and the only thing that goes in the opposite direction is the self-sufficient home, where instead of going to the movies, you stream movies or whatever else pleases
And
you.
work too, right, Doug? The way that people work from different countries at the same meeting just by going on air like this, right?
Right. And you can do that from a cornfield
Mhm.
or from a housing development in a cornfield. I think the relative intimacy of daily life before COVID-19 was a huge plus for New Haven. I think people really liked being part of neighborhood communities and out and about. And I think it's really important to New Haven and every other city that some combination of vaccines, testing, and treatments gets into place as soon as possible.
You think that's, I guess this got back, I'm sorry for repeating a question from earlier. Will we go back to life with some semblance of normal with those adjustments? Will we still gather a lot in person? Or will there be an accelerated trend where people aren't going to value? I agree with you. I think that New Haven's has thrived in the last couple of decades because of that very factor. People loved being with each other. They love being part of a neighborhood community. They love being part of a New Haven art scene, the tech scene, and is that going to be possible in America long term? Are we going to adjust? Like after 9/11, we made some adjustments to giving up privacies and freedoms and security, measures like even just flying a plane. Then we adjusted, and we're already adjusting to the new. Will we get back to those conditions that enable New Haven to thrive and cities to thrive?
Yeah, I think we will. But I don't think anybody knows how long it's going to take to effectively defeat this virus. And I think there are likely going to be not one but a dozen vaccines that reach the market, and possibly some treatments. But even really simple family stuff like vacationing with different generations of the same family, which is really important in my family, is difficult right now. You really can't do it.
That's true. We too. We're desperately missing our grandchild. Will that come back?
It'll come back, but the medical developments that are essential to it are in progress, and that part of the American economy and much of the world economy is actually very strong. And I think sometime in 2021, we should be past that.
My money's on the llamas, Doug. I think the llamas are going to have the antibodies for this virus. Two other questions I want to ask you before I let you go. Car-free streets. So remember I told you about on left and right, I believe everybody's using this pandemic as an opportunity to push proposals they've wanted for a long time. And one of those is car-free streets. We closed off the road to East Rock Park so it wouldn't be as dense so people could walk in the street. Oakland began by closing off streets so people can walk more spread out. New York is now going to close 100 miles of road, which has sort of been a dream of people like ours, right? The new urbanists for a long time. Do you think this will accelerate that trend?
I think it very well. I think it very well might. I just bought a new car, so I can't. I can only give 2 cheers for this.
Well, that's your default anyway.
Well,
2 cheers.
There's a walking street in Burlington, Vermont that was put there when Bernie
that was
Sanders,
the best. That's that down Church Street, I think it is. They closed the main downtown street. I went there a couple summers ago, and there are just so many people out every day sitting at cafes, walking, busking, that after a few days I had a theory that they were shipped in actors because there were so many of them enjoying outdoor urban life. It almost seemed like a joke. I know you spent a lot of time there in the summers, but people haven't copied that, Doug. That's been the case for 20 years, right?
Yeah, more than 20, 30 and some. And something the New Haven Green could be the focus for some street closing that would you'd have to have better parking and better mass transit than we now have to make it really work.
Yeah, mass transit. What about climate change? I'm thinking of coasts. Again, you know so much more about this stuff than I do. I have never figured out why government is helping people rebuild homes on coastlines. Like why we're doing that by Morris Cove, and along the whole shoreline there, why Florida, New York. Isn't all that stuff going to be underwater? And what does that mean now post-COVID-19 when we rebuild cities? Are we going to address that issue?
The evidence is against our addressing that issue. Think about South Beach in Miami, where they're still building condos and selling them at highly profitable prices. They've actually raised the base of some of the new condos a few feet so that they say this will be above the flood.
Then it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt the neighboring properties, right? When they do that.
Oh, absolutely. There are many cities where it's life and death. Charleston, South Carolina, which is a wonderful little city, is almost indefensible against the level of sea level rise that we're apt to face. New Haven, those are huge issues. The people who insure our house on Lincoln Street tell us that we're near the level at which they would think of it as a risk.
Wow.
26 feet above high tide, and that seems to me like quite a lot.
Yeah. So, Doug, you write in this book now, 2 Cheers for Capitalism. That might end up being the name, it might not. I think it sounds like the thesis is that there's a big chunk of it that fundamentally doesn't work great, but a lot of it does work well, and you haven't found a better system. I don't know if that's a fair way to put it.
That's not right.
Would that come into play here? Would these be examples of ways that our system rewards short-term thinking ever since the shareholder rights movement and individual gain, like raising one house, as opposed to communal gain? Is that one of the challenges? And then do you come down on a Elizabeth Warren side that says the way FDR did, save it by making it work better, true to its original goals through more regulation, as opposed to finding an alternative system?
That's very well put. The downside of of short-term thinking um, and management of corporations, which takes the real competition and the real excitement out of. There's a book by a guy named Philippon right now called The Great Reversal, which asks this question: how come we pay twice as much as people in Europe and Asia for web service and phone service? And the answer is because we are faced with monopolistic or highly oligopolistic companies.
And isn't that fiber? Isn't that the Susan Crawford book about how it would serve every business and every individual's interest in America to have far, far, far faster service and cheaper service through fiber, and the oligopolistic interests of the telecoms and the cable companies have prevented government from allowing more fiber optic service to be laid in.
Absolutely, that's a big part of the story, and it has a long-term cost, and it takes a kind of political leadership not visible these days to make, or not visible at the White House level these days, to make a dent in that. The Europeans watched our economy when it was really great, copied many aspects of it, and we've let ourselves slip back in a profound way.
Well, Doug Ray, every time I speak to you, I get inspired because you make me think about so much I never thought about so many important issues. Today was your cautious optimism. You seem to feel like we are going to be hugging again and singing together again and getting together across generations. And that while you're very concerned about some short-term threats to New Haven, both immigrant communities and the university-driven small business economy, it seems like you're feeling bullish on the city's continued development. That's good to hear. Because if you say so, it's going to happen.
I wish I believed that, Paul.
Well, I believe it. Thanks so much for joining us today on WNHH. Doug Ray, thanks so much for making time to be on our station. Thanks to Harry Droz, WNHH's station manager, the man who does the magic behind the scenes and gets us to so many platforms that I think they're going to have to invent a new mathematical formula to a new power to say how many different dimensions of cyberspace the show is being consumed on.
Paul, we got 2 comments at the end.
Oh, yeah. Read them out, Harry.
Marquisha Rick says Houston is problematic.
Yes.
And Bruce Oren says Europe doesn't shy away from public ownership of utilities, including broadband.
Good comments. Doug, you want to weigh in on either of those? Is Houston hopeless? Is public broadband ownership necessary?
It's one way to get it done. But the small government theory that Republicans have sold in the last generation here leads away from that and leads where we are. So I'm not wildly optimistic about.
Could we make it into community nonprofit regional ownership of utilities, municipal ownership, electric companies, or what they're doing in North Carolina when they started having those communal fiber optic networks for broadband that were nonprofit until the government caved into lobbyists and prevented any more cities from doing that? Might that be a way to take Bruce's idea and apply it to what's politically feasible in America?
Yeah, it might. The Green Bay Packers are a community-owned entity, and that seems to work.
And what about Marquisha's point on Houston? What are the prospects for Houston? Well,
Houston is a wreck, and I don't know. Houston is beyond. I think it may be beyond redemption. The decline of oil prices will make matters even tougher in Houston.
All right. Well, thanks again for so much, Doug Ray, for making the time. Thanks for those great questions at the end, folks. Thanks again to Harry Droz. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to listen free and fly free with us all day and all night here at WNHH FM, New Haven's home for community radio.